So hello and welcome to Supercharging Your Regression Testing with BackstopJS. I'm Frances Litt. This is my first Drupal camp and I'm having an awesome day so far. I hope you all are too. I work as a project specialist at Coldfront Labs and I work on automating our testing and especially our regression testing, and also looking into kind of automating our workflows within the company. So since we're talking about visual regression testing today, I wanted to briefly define what that is so we're all on the same page about what I'm talking about. So we're going to start with what is it? It's the process of basically making sure that the UI of your website hasn't changed unintentionally after an update or a new deployment. So it's a way, performing visual regression testing is a way of capturing or finding problems such...
The red button?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, perfect. Sorry.
It's all good.
Sorry,
That's okay. So it's a way of catching problems such as if components happen to end up being hidden after someone makes some changes and they didn't mean to hide those, or if you have theme compilation errors. These can be caught through the process of running these types of regression tests. Now, you might think that visual regression tests don't need to be automated because we can all look at a screen and we can see if something has changed. But as your projects get more complicated, or as you get many pages on your site, it quickly becomes overwhelming that you can't check every element and make sure that things are the same when you are having updated or having done a deployment. So let's walk through that a little bit. Can anyone tell me if these two images are the same or different?
Different.
Okay, and what is the difference? There we go. Awesome. Okay, so maybe we can manually test these things. What about this one? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. They are the same. What about this one? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. No pressure. These are actually different. So there is a typo down here. Now, to be fair, we're not normally going to use visual regression tests to capture typos, right? These are not checking the content of our site. But you get the idea. As things become more complex, it becomes a lot harder to see what has changed versus what has stayed the same. So that's where BackstopJS comes in. There are quite a few options of, programs that you can use to automate visual regression tests. But I have found that it's a pretty good option, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But first of all, it's an open source project available on GitHub, and it basically works by taking a screenshot of your web page, a gold standard version of your web page, so what I call the before image, and then and that's also called the reference image in Backstop, and then it also takes an image of your after, which is your test image of your new deployment, and or your new version of the web page, and it performs a diff to compare those. So generally, when you're running tests, you'll have your set of reference images that you've captured already. You perform the update, and then you run the test to make sure that all those images match. Backstop can spit out an HTML report, which you can look at and review the results. Hopefully everything passes. And a JUnit report, which is helpful for if you integrate this into your CI processes. You can go and have that be automatically, have results be automatically displayed in whatever program you're using for your CI. All right, so why choose Backstop? So it's a pretty easy to install and configure. As I said, it's available on GitHub, and you can install it using NPM. There's a large active community on GitHub. So I've been working with it for about 2 months, and every bug I've run into, I've been able to find a solution on GitHub, and that's pretty impressive. There have been quite a few problems, and just as many answers, so that's awesome. It's easy to configure and to customize for your own requirements, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And like I said, it can be integrated into your continuous integration pipelines, so that makes it even easier to just run these tests continually and make sure that, that your tests are up to date and that your software isn't breaking. So how does it work? Just a little detail here. It renders web pages using a headless browser. They currently support Chrome, Phantom, and Slimmer.js. I know they're moving towards really focusing on Chrome. Remember, these types of tests are not for testing how your website works in different browsers. It's for testing that your website hasn't changed. So we're not caring about the browser so much, we're just caring about how that thing is being rendered, and that your CSS hasn't broken in that specific browser. You can also simulate user interactions, such as hovering on elements. If you want a button to change when you hover on it, you can check that that has remained the same. Or you can even click on a menu and have the ability to see the menu contents and to check that those menus haven't changed over time. Resemble.js is used to perform the diff, which is comparing the pixels between the images, and that's another GitHub project. Okay, so we're going to run a little demo here of using BackstopJS. And for this, I need to figure out how to get out of full screen mode. Oops. There we go. Okay, we're just going to close that for now. Like I said, you can use npm to install Backstop. Here I have, I already have it installed locally, and I've defined some npm scripts here that are just using the basic commands that are available in Backstop. So this is kind of small for you guys. Let's fix that. There we go. So you can see that we have Backstop init. This is used for initializing Backstop in your project directory. And actually, we can just run that right now and get that going. And you'll see what's happened is that's created a Backstop data folder and a backstop.json file. So let's look at this JSON file. Basically, this is defining the test run that you're going to do, and I can make that a little better to see. And so first of all, when you're running Backstop tests, you run a bunch of tests at the same time, so you can have defined a whole lot of pages that you'd like it to go and check. And you can also, the first thing in this list is these viewports. These are the screen sizes that you'd like it to test. So every test that you define in this file down here in scenarios is going to be run against each of those viewports. Okay? This is handy because you can test, phone and tablet, for example, here at the same time in the same test run. Down here, you'll notice it does define some scripts. These are generally used, a before script is, for example, if you needed to log into your website before you're taking the screenshot, you could have that action defined in the before script. And an onReady script is something that happens when your page has loaded. You can, for example, this is where you define that click interaction to open a menu before you take the screenshot. The scenarios array are the individual, I call them test cases. They're just what you'd like to test with this specific instance. So there are all these properties here. The only one you really need to set is the URL, because if you're actually comparing the same URL, you'd enter the URL, take the reference image, make your updates, and then run the test, and it would check. You're also able to specify if you have, say, a development environment and a prod environment up, and you want to test your prod against your dev, or your dev against your prod, you can specify your reference URL being the prod, and then your URL being the test, or the dev environment. So to go a little further in this, we're just going to grab a file I have ready here where I've defined the URLs that I'd like to test today. Doesn't seem to want to work for me. That's okay. All right. So here I've specified my own computer as with the test URL because I'm running my own version of the Drupal Camp Ottawa site. And I've set a couple of other properties in here. And what we're going to do first is after we've set those URLs to test, you run backstop ref, or it's backstop reference in terms of the actual script that backstop has. And what you'll see here is after that's finished, in that backstop data folder, it creates a bitmaps reference folder. And in there, you can see that for each viewport that I have defined in my JSON, I have the phone version of the website and the tablet version. All right. The next step, I mean, it's as easy as this. You want to run your test. And what this is going to do is it's going to go to the URL that I specified as my test URL, take the test images, compare the test images. We have a failure, which we shouldn't have. So let's see what went wrong there. All right. It looks like things didn't load properly. Anyway, that's an interesting, or maybe things changed. Let's see. Actually, so this is a good example of how to use the report. You can see that actually the announcements have changed. So in the time between us taking those screenshots, and what's handy is you're seeing the test image and you're comparing it to the reference image here, and you're also getting to compare it if you want to look at it like this. So it's a very handy report, and there we go. We found a difference, but it's a good one. It's intentional. So. Let me just make sure that I've covered all the cool things I wanted to show there. Oh, well, okay, so now we've noticed that there's a change and we want to update the reference images, right? What you can do is you would run backstop approve. And hopefully our tests would match up after that. And if they don't, I'm not going to keep up with the constant changes to the Drupal Camp Ottawa website. So there we go. We have passing tests. All right. That was actually worked really well for me because I was going to go and change the website for you, but we had it work for us. So. All right, so getting into a couple of the more, I mean, we just showed the URL there. So what can you do with backstop? Something that's handy is if you have separate components and you actually may only want to select one element on the page and make sure that that hasn't changed, you can use selectors. Here I've selected this card body to check. And so that'll only take a screenshot of that item, and then you'll be able to only compare those items across your test run. In this example, you know, the map might take forever to load, and you might not even care about the map because someone else is looking after the map. So you can hide elements, and then you just be comparing the layout of your web page and not components that you don't care to check all the time. I found this particularly useful for, you know, if you have like a latest news release and you don't want to be updating your test all the time. To make that test constant over time, you just hide that element. You don't care about the image or the text. You're just making sure that the element is there in your layout. Another item is if that map, again, takes forever to load, you can say, well, wait until I've logged this message to the console and then take the screenshot. And that's what you ready event is used for that. You can set a delay in milliseconds, or you can also use a ready selector. So you wait until a selector is available in the DOM and then take the image. I think I gave this example before. If you would like to test the hover on a button, for example, here I've told Backstop to look to mouse over the sign up for free button, and so you're making sure that your response, the button is responding as you mean it to. And we got into this a little bit before, that you can specify your own viewports. So depending on the types of devices that you'd like to support, you can add them to the viewports list, and again, make sure that, I mean, it's very handy that you can specify one test case, but then have it run against all these different screen sizes. All right, so we're gonna just grab a different BackstopJSON file here. And here you've noticed I've just added test cases for the features we just talked about, and I've changed the viewports only down to a single viewport because I'm not interested in running these tests against multiple screen sizes. A kind of fun feature in Backstop is by default it would replace your reference images when you run Backstop reference. In the way that my workflows work at work, I want to keep reference images even if I'm not running the reference command on all of my tests. So what you can do is you can add a flag to your backstop reference command, --I, make sure that you're not deleting those references files every time, and you're just adding to the list or overwriting the files that do get overwritten by the tests that you're creating reference files for at the moment. So that might become clear here. We're running four tests in this JSON file, but now we have 6 images because I decided to keep all the test images. So we've created those reference images, and we'll go ahead and run the test. We'll see if the site's updated in the past 2 minutes. And it looks like it didn't, or I guess the last second rather. So here I've only chose to select the header, and so that's all that Backstop, that the screenshot has captured. In this example, it's very small, but you can see that the map isn't being displayed because I chose to hide it in this test. In this example, I specified a ready event, or actually a ready selector, so I decided to wait for the text in this card to load because I was finding that the screenshot was being taken before everything had a chance to load. And so that's one way of delaying the screenshot long enough to get what you'd like. And then here, just that sign up button being highlighted because I hovered over it. If we go back here, we get to my favorite part of the talk today, and that is tips and tricks that I've learned while using Backstop. So hopefully I'm going to save you some time in your own efforts by sharing my experiences. Number one, I would highly recommend making your own JavaScript file to define your test cases, to make it easier to define your test cases. And I'll show you an example of doing that right in our folder over here. So in your, or actually I should point to this, in your Backstop commands, you can add a config path to the BackstopJSON file. So you're just telling Backstop where to look for the JSON definition of the test that it has to run. And what you can do is you can point this as add a JavaScript file that spits out the JSON. So that's super handy because you can actually create a configuration, and there are examples online of people that have done this as well. Let's take a look at this example. So I have a whole list of URLs that I'd like to test for this one site. And I just have defined them in this array, and then I go and I generate the scenarios list by filling in details from a default test that I have defined, which means that I don't have to fill in all the properties for all the tests specifically to what I want. I can just define them in one place and have this just fill in my scenarios in my JSON that Backstop runs. The other, so I currently have two setups here. One is that I can define a list of relative URLs and just append those onto the domain that I want to test. And then I also have it reading individual tests that have kind of some more specific properties. And so they'll take the rest of the properties from my default test, but I also can have very specific to the test case options specified. So that's handy, and it saves a ton of work in terms of you don't want to have to define your tests every single time. You'll probably have a whole lot of tests that use the same options. All right, so that was number one. I would recommend doing something like that. And again, there are lots of examples online. Second, use Puppeteer as the engine. When in your backstop.json file, you specify an engine. I started out using Chromie, but it was very buggy. And what I was finding was I'd be running, the job would be running in our continuous integration pipeline, and it would just hang. And I searched everything. I could not find what was going on. And finally, I found some issue on GitHub where Garrus, the guy who originally started Backstop, he just said, switch to Chromie, to the person who was complaining. And sure enough, I should have done that like weeks ago, because everything just works. It's able to run a lot more tests. It's faster, and I haven't had I've had it hang twice. Whereas before it was almost every time that I was trying to run the job that it would not be able to get through my list of tests. One thing to note is I had an issue so mismatch threshold, this is just getting into a little nitty gritty, but that's the percentage of pixels that can be different between your test and your reference images. It's less picky with Puppeteer. So I got a couple of false positives when I first switched from Chromie to Puppeteer. But if you lower the threshold, it must be like some slight difference. If you lower the threshold, you will be fine, and it does fail the test that you want it to fail. It's just a matter of finding out what exactly it's looking for. And actually, I have my mismatch threshold set at 0, and it isn't having a problem passing the test that I'm expecting to pass. So that seems fine for now. Another, some things you might run into is if you're getting you might get some issues with your SSL certificates. There are options to set that you can ignore those errors, and also that you'll probably, if you end up using this, you'll probably come across the need to specify the no sandbox and disable set UID sandbox arguments with your engine. But again, it's easy to find all this stuff online. Okay, number 3, have a labeling strategy. So when you're defining test cases, it's easy to get caught up in just setting the URL and telling it to go. But what happens is eventually you're going to end up with a long list of tests, and you'll not really know why you're testing a specific URL. So there's probably a reason you chose to put that in your list of tests. But I would recommend, if this is testing your main content types, just write content types within the label. And that label, I should have shown you, is it's just one of the options in your test case. So generally, I can show you how I have that set up here. Well, general, so that's a pretty terrible way of defining a label. But basically, you can set this label to be as long as you want. Well, I haven't found a limit to it, and just be as specific as you can. Don't use general. Ugh. Anyway, so something that I found is, sanity versus regression. Are you going to be running these in every update to dev? Well, then it's your smoke test, it's your sanity test. But if you're only going to be running these to test your full site, those are your regression tests, and mark them as so. Say what you're testing, and also, maybe you'll only want to run these tests against prod. Well, write that in the label, because then what you can do is you can filter your test run to only include those prod tests. So it's a very handy feature as long as you've labeled things correctly. Use screenshots, use scripts. So this, again, I mentioned this earlier. You can log into your site. Something I found really handy was I was having a problem where with kind of lazy loading pages, the screenshot would be taken at one part of the page's loading for the reference image, and then the test would be taken at another. Things had progressed a little bit further maybe that time. So I was getting inconsistencies in my test in my screenshots. So I found that someone had written a script to scroll down the length of the viewport and do that for the length of the page and wait for give things time to load. And basically that solved the problem. I was able to load very, complex, lazy loading pages and be able to get the screenshots with items fully displayed as they were meant to be. Oh, and something I ran into was I thought that I could just input the selector when you want to click on something, but you actually have to also specify the onReady script, since that points to the script that defines how the click is going to actually be done. So just to get you past those little annoyances, you have to specify the onReady script as well. Oh, this was a feature I just found last week, and this is exciting because I had used labeling and filtering to define which test cases I wanted to run with specific viewports. But it turns out that in August, there's this feature that hasn't made it into the main documentation yet. You can actually specify viewports within a scenario. So we were looking at viewports that are defined alongside the scenarios array. So right here we have our viewports defined, and then we have our scenarios. In this case, every one of those scenarios would be run against those viewports. But what you can do is in the actual scenario specify a viewport, and that will override the settings that are set generally. So that's really handy because a lot of the time I have tests that I only want to run on one viewport, and then I have a set of tests that I would like to run against all of the viewports. So. Design robust test cases. Okay, so I learned this the hard way. Last week I was working on a set of about 100 tests that I was spending a lot of time updating reference images because content was changing, pictures were changing, the lists that were being displayed in views were changing. So make sure when you're designing or thinking about your test cases and writing them that you're thinking about things changing over time. What I ended up doing, for example, I had a list of reports that was being returned, but as the client was adding reports, my screenshots kept being out of date. So filter those reports. Filter them down to a certain set of dates, and then all of a sudden your problems with changing content will disappear, but you'll still have a screenshot or a test case that is checking that your layout and everything is set, and that your reports are showing up. Again, if you have we have some image like carousels, so the image is changing all the time, and your screenshots aren't dependable enough to take the screenshot at the exact second every time that a specific image loads. So I'd suggest hiding those types of images and making sure that they're tested in some other fashion, because it's too hard to keep up with making sure the timing is just perfect enough to get your test to be robust. And then again, if you have elements that are showing like the latest and greatest or most popular item, I'd probably have tests for that, but I would test them separately. I wouldn't include them in those kinds of elements. Should be hidden in your long list of test cases, because it's just you don't want to be going in and checking and changing those reference images all the time. When you run into problems, there is debug and debug window, and remember to make use of these. I don't really have much more to say about that, but they have been useful to me when figuring out problems with my test cases. And lastly, integrate these into your CI process. So don't write these tests and ignore them. And also check the reports. I mean, make sure that these are being run, because you invested the time in writing them. Make sure that they're being run and checked, and that you're paying attention to them. So where this comes from is that I wrote a whole bunch of tests and then I ignored them for a couple of weeks. And when I went back, I found all sorts of bugs. These tests had found bugs, but I'd been ignoring the reports. So be sure that you do look at the reports and make use of them, because they actually are super, super duper handy. But unfortunately, there is the manual aspect that you do have to go in and look at them and figure out what's going on, and make sure that if there are changes, you are updating the reference images. And if the tests are failing because of kind of those bad items that I talked about, like things changing over time, change the test case. Make sure that it's a robust test case that's not going to need you to babysit it. That's everything. Are there any questions? Yes?
I'm just curious if you've ever used this in conjunction with a module like Style Guide, where you use Style Guide, where kind of like get all your elements for a particular site that you can test with, just make sure that's...
So full disclosure, I'm totally new to Drupal.
Okay.
So I don't know anything on the Drupal side of things. Sorry.
No, it's fine. It just seems like this is awesome. And the Style Guide module is awesome, because it shows you the main elements of your site once you get those.
Okay.
And so then if you test this one page, you get pretty much a good test on all of your site.
Oh, cool.
I should show you the Style Guide module.
Yeah, I would like to.
Page, it grabs all the items from your theme and just sticks them on there, so that you can see them all in one place.
Awesome.
You actually do use it. But you're right. Yeah, you should totally test that page.
And if you look at any page, I feel like that's the page you want to look at.
Yay, I learned something. Yes?
Supposing you've got problems with accessibility, is there anything special it does for accessibility?
I'm going to say no, because, so I meant to say this actually earlier. These visual regression tests are not meant to replace other types of testing, right? So this is just another tool in your toolbox, but you still should have your unit tests, you should still have your functional tests, and your accessibility tests are another component of that full testing toolbox. So. Any other questions? Yes?
So is this related to filters? Filters you create to ignore specific parts of the website?
Sorry, can you say that again?
This question is related to filters, to ones which you use to ignore parts of your website. So let's say, how does the selectors work? How do you identify dynamic IDs?
Are you in terms of like when you're specifying a selector on the page?
Ignore like the map.
Yeah,
Right.
so all that is it's a CSS selector. So you can specify a class name, or you can specify an ID. An ID would be better to ignore certain, those specific elements. And it's the same with the click selector or whatever. It's all CSS selectors. Yep.
Supposing you've got to change to just fix it. One pixel, I saw something.
Yeah. So the mismatch threshold is the percentage of pixels that can be different between the two images. But you can imagine in a case where everything has moved a pixel, that's 100% difference, right? So this is where screenshot tests have a huge drawback. They can't guess. They can't guess at anything. So I don't have an answer for that. Yeah, it's a problem, and why personally I have not ever really liked screenshot tests, but they have their value. I'm seeing it now. They have their place as long as you can make sure that really it has to be the same environment taking the screenshot too, right? Because this is something I've run into with my, if I take reference images on my computer and then I run the tests in a Docker image, they're gonna fail because the fonts are different. Everything's different on the in the different browsers. So I actually end up generating the reference images on the Docker image and then putting them into my reference image folder and running them like that. Anyone else? Yes.
Can you test if like a singular frame matches within like a time threshold? Like if you things that are changing, but you know at least one of those frames should match your reference frame.
Oh. Unless there's a way of specifying it in the URL, which I doubt, not that I know of. Because you have to be able to like identify the thing through a URL, or I mean if there's some way for you to get the image of that and then save it in your reference images, then you should be able to do that. But I think it would be really hard with something that's changing over time to make sure it takes the screenshot at the right time.
Okay.
Yes?
Would you track the reference image typed web version? So let's say that's my release 2 point something, and these are the reference images for that release.
That's a good idea. I haven't done that, but you could definitely do that, especially with the flag that I showed, which you're keeping all your reference images. You could definitely, something you can see here, in the file where you're defining the JSON, there's an ID. This prepends all of those image names. So you could put version 2 and have that be labeling those images for you. Hi.
Is there a resource for like prefab viewports so you get all the different phone varieties? You already test across all the Samsung phones. All the different solutions.
I don't know. I haven't looked that up, so I'm not sure. But I'm sure that the information is out there somewhere. I just don't know where you'd get it.
Will it do sort of difference between Retina and full res, or like a 2x, 4x scaling layout?
I don't know. Sorry. Yeah.
Would you compare mega menus mentioned? Can you compare some of mega menus on navigation?
Sorry.
How would you compare mega menus on navigation so that you can compare?
So it's just comparing the items that are displayed in a menu. So what I would do is I would define a click selector in the scenario. There's an option to say click selector and have it hit the menu, and then the menu would be displayed when the screenshot is taken.
And it's in the file, in configuration file that needs to be changed?
So that would be in your, okay, so I have a scenario defined right here. Actually, I have one right here. So yeah, it's when you're defining a scenario, you would say click selectors, and I could put my menu here. You tell it how long you would like it to wait after the interaction has happened, so that's a delay. This is a delay in milliseconds or a delay waiting for a selector. And then the other thing, oh, I have the scripts defined up here. So you need an onReady script defined, because if you look at your the engine scripts, so for Puppet, this is my onReady, and that's just pointing to the script that defines the click and hover interactions. And these are out of the box; they're provided for you. So. And then you can write your own if you need them. You're welcome. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much.